Hey guys, tonight we sink our hands, yes, hands, into a world where eating dinner meant diving into greasy mounds of food without a single piece of cutlery in sight. Imagine a banquet lit by flickering candlelight, meats piled high, gravy sloshing onto wooden tables, and everyone around you just grabbing what they want. No forks. No rules. Just fingers, maybe a spoon if you're feeling fancy, and a shared napkin that hasn't been washed since the last jousting match. You might not survive this dinner party without a serious case of dysentery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where all of you are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit at the long wooden table, the smell of roast goose and honey-glazed carrots thick in the air. You're in a castle somewhere in 12th century England, and the food is served not on plates but on thick slabs of stale bread called trenchers. There's no such thing as a personal serving dish. What's in front of you is communal, and if someone wants more, they lean over and grab it with their bare hands, including that nobleman across from you with what looks suspiciously like a healing plague boil on his knuckle. This is how most of Europe eats, and how they've eaten for centuries. Hands are the tools of civilization, they say. Well, hands and maybe a pointy knife that doubles as a weapon if the wine starts flowing too freely. In polite circles, you're expected to use 3 fingers, never the full hand, because full hand grabbing is considered crude. But 3 fingers deep into a spit-roasted pheasant leg is still messy, and if you drop something? That's what dogs under the table are for. Literally. There's a bizarre etiquette to this mess. You're supposed to wash your hands before and after the meal. Bowls of water are passed around, and sometimes even scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender. But here's the twist, 1 bowl. Everyone uses it. Think of it as a medieval hot tub for your fingertips. Cozy. Communal. A microbiological horror show. Historians still argue whether the preference for eating with hands stemmed from genuine tradition or just an absence of viable alternatives. But one thing's clear, the fork was known. It just wasn't welcome. Not yet. Over in the Byzantine Empire, people were already dabbling in fork usage. But here you better not let anyone catch you using some dainty, pronged implement to spear your roast lamb. That was for heretics, or worse, Italians. And yet, the practicality of it nags at you. The chicken is slippery. The gravy's pooling up in awkward places. And your tunic is already stained. Somewhere, in the back of your mind, a little voice whispers, there has to be a better way. Cue the dripping meat juices down your wrist. You try to wipe it off on your sleeve, like everyone else. Nobody bats an eye. Across the hall, a knight is holding a chicken drumstick in one hand and wiping his mouth with the other, on the drapery. He's wearing armor. The drapery loses. You spot a monk daintily flicking mashed parsnips off his chin, while chewing and talking about sin. You realize, if there's a sacred art to eating, it's not happening here. But not everyone's struggling like you. That older woman at the head of the table, maybe she's a duchess, seems to have developed her own strategy. 2 knives. She's got one hand gripping meat and the other carving with precision, like she's filleting a fish while performing an opera. Maybe she's had some exposure to continental styles. Maybe she's just tired of sticky fingers. Either way, she's onto something. Quirky historical tidbit, in some circles, food wasn't even eaten sitting. You'd recline, Roman style, lounging on cushions, your head propped on one arm as you fed yourself grapes with the other. This didn't last long in colder climates where floors were damp and rats were bold. But in swankier medieval courts, it lingered for a while, mostly to flex how rich you were. Forks wouldn't fit that vibe, too practical, too sharp. And so, you continue. You gnaw. You slurp. You dip your bread trencher into someone else's stew, pretending not to notice when they raise an eyebrow. There's a kind of intimacy to all of this, shared food, shared germs, shared glances. But it's also exhausting. You want to enjoy the roast duck without worrying whether your fingers are going to smell like onions till Sunday. At one point, someone tries to hand you a spoon. It's carved from bone, heavy and cold, and the bowl is so deep it's more like a ladle. You try to sip from it. The broth dribbles down your chin. Congratulations, you've just passed the initiation test for medieval table life. It wasn't all grimy chaos though. There was ceremony. Pages brought food on silver platters. Dishes arrived in a strict order. But the eating? Pure, primal, finger-based indulgence. And this wasn't some low-class affair. Nobles, bishops, even royalty dug in by hand. In fact, it was considered manly, warrior-like, to eat this way. A fork, in contrast, would have looked delicate. Historians still argue whether resistance to forks was rooted in practicality or pride. But in the dining halls you now wander, there's no doubt it's a matter of honor. You tear your meat. You dip your bread. You wear your feast like a badge of survival. And as you look down at your messy hands, you wonder, not for the last time, how long this can go on. Because let's face it, your sleeve can only take so much gravy. You blink, and now you're in Venice, sunlight glinting off the Grand Canal, gondolas slicing through the water, and an air thick with perfume, politics, and preposterous wealth. It's the 11th century, and you've landed smack in the middle of a scandal, one not about murder, betrayal, or war, but about a dainty two-pronged utensil made of gold. Yes, gold. Because if you're going to offend tradition, you may as well do it with style. Her name is Theodora Decana, a Byzantine princess of outrageous refinement, and she's just married into a wealthy Venetian family. At the wedding feast, while everyone else digs in like civilized beasts, with knives and knuckles, Theodora calmly pulls out a glittering fork. And not just any fork. This one's custom-made, bejeweled, probably blessed by 3 bishops, and definitely polished by someone unpaid. She uses it to lift a piece of candy pear to her lips. The hall goes quiet. You could hear a boiled onion drop. Now here's the twist. Forks do exist in Italy at this point, but only in the kitchens. Used for carving meat, handling pasta, or maybe skewering the occasional eel. But at the dining table? That's a whole different battlefield. A woman, no less, using a golden fork in public? That wasn't just an etiquette slip, it was a social earthquake. Historians still argue whether Theodora's act was deliberate rebellion or simply everyday opulence from someone raised among Eastern luxuries. In the Byzantine court, forks had already become part of elite dining. Over there, they were used with grace, paired with cloth napkins, and washed between courses. Here in Venice, they were suspicious. You hear a murmur ripple through the guests. Someone whispers that Theodora's fork resembles a devil's pitchfork. A bishop frowns so hard his wine spills. People start looking at her sideways, as if she might levitate or summon demons. She doesn't. She just takes another bite. And you? You're fascinated. Because this is the first time you realize a fork isn't just a tool. It's a statement. A social flex. A threat to finger-based superiority. You glance around the room. The men shift uncomfortably. The women watch Theodora like she's conjuring sorcery. One older noblewoman pointedly picks up her knife and slices her roast lamb with such force that her bracelet flies off. Passive aggression, medieval style. Theodora, for her part, doesn't flinch. She finishes her dish, dabs her mouth with a handkerchief embroidered with gold thread, and proceeds as if nothing at all is out of place. This, of course, only enrages the crowd more. They can't believe she didn't use her hands. They can't believe she isn't covered in sauce. They can't believe she's elegant. Quirky fact time, some Venetian chroniclers actually described Theodora's fork use as excessive delicacy. That's right. A fork was considered too delicate for a noblewoman. Mind you, these are the same people who wore tights, curled their mustaches, and bathed once a season if the stars aligned. And yet, the damage is done. The fork has made its entrance, and like an ill-mannered house guest, it's not going to leave quietly. You can't unsee it. You can't unfeel the clean precision of a bite-sized morsel raised by a golden palm. You're starting to crave it. But not everyone's convinced. Religious leaders, for one, are not amused. A few months after the wedding, a preacher delivers a homily warning against vanities imported from the East. And while he doesn't name Theodora specifically, he may as well have held up a sign that read "No fancy forks allowed." This is where the backlash begins. Forks become a symbol of corruption, of foreignness, of moral decay. To eat with one is to reject humility, to distance oneself from God's natural tools, your own fingers. One monk even writes that using a fork is tantamount to mocking God's design. You try to imagine Jesus at the Last Supper, passing around tiny forks like party favors, and you snort into your sleeve. Still, Venice is not so easily scandalized. Beneath the pearl-crested disapproval lies a current of curiosity. At smaller dinner parties, nobles begin to whisper about the Byzantine method. A few brave women request their own forks, smaller, humbler ones made of silver or wood. They use them in private, with trusted friends. It's like a gourmet resistance movement. Meanwhile, Theodora doesn't care. She throws more parties. Serves elaborate confections that basically require a fork. Glazed figs, honeyed nuts, rosewater-soaked pastries so sticky they'd weld your fingers together. Suddenly, a fork isn't just desirable, it's practical. You realize something that no one else wants to admit: fingers are failing you. Historians still argue whether this quiet shift in upper-class behavior marked the true beginning of Europe's fork adoption. But whether it started here or in some silent salon tucked away in Florence, the point remains, literally. You lean forward, watching a guest timidly ask a servant if there are more of those little prongs. The servant hesitates, then vanishes into the kitchen. A moment later, he returns with one, wrapped in cloth, like contraband. The guest accepts it with a half-guilty smile, like he's just committed a very polite crime. And you? You take a bite with your fingers and sigh. Because now you know there's a better way. You've seen it, felt it, wished for it. But until the rest of Europe catches up, it's back to fingers, elbows, and gravy-slicked dignity. You've barely digested your candied pears when the whispers start. The fork, it turns out, isn't just offending Aunt Matilda's sensibilities or setting off a fashion statement among bored nobles. No, it's stirring up something far deeper. Religious discomfort. Moral outrage. Even a hint of cosmic blasphemy. You don't just find yourself at a dinner table anymore, you're suddenly caught in a spiritual war over what you're allowed to hold between your fingers. You're in a modest chapel now, somewhere in 11th century northern Italy. Stone walls. The scent of incense. Latin chants echo softly in the background. A priest steps forward, delivering a sermon that starts with humility and ends with, yes, you guessed it, a rant about forks. Not by name, mind you. That would be uncouth. But everyone in the room knows who the target is, that strange pronged utensil imported from the East by women too wealthy for their own salvation. Forks, according to him, are a grotesque rejection of God's gifts. God gave you fingers, didn't he? 5 of them. Beautiful, versatile, and blessed. To put metal between your hand and your food? That's like rejecting your own creation. You glance down at your own hands, suddenly guilty about the fork you watched Theodora use last week. You're almost convinced. Historians still argue whether the church's fork phobia was genuinely theological or just the usual resistance to change, wrapped in incense and Latin. But there it is, the two-pronged utensil, suddenly accused of being decadent, prideful, and vaguely demonic. It doesn't help that the earliest table forks resemble miniature pitchforks. One clergyman actually writes that such instruments are tools of Satan, designed to mock divine design. Bold claim, considering Satan probably isn't too fussed about cutlery. And it's not just religious elites clutching their rosaries. Everyday people are catching the vibe too. In villages, when rumors of noble women eating with metal prongs reach the streets, you hear laughter, suspicion, and just a dash of fear. One baker you meet says he heard forks make people infertile. Another swears he saw a man stab himself in the lip trying to eat with one. You're not sure which story is more likely, but neither helps the cause. The irony is delicious, though. The church has no issue with golden chalices, jewel-encrusted Bibles, and elaborate feasts laid out with artistic flair. But a fork? That's vanity incarnate. You feel the sarcasm itching in your throat, but you suppress it. You're trying to blend in, after all. Still, behind closed doors, some clergy are skeptical of all the moral panic. You catch wind of a bishop, name lost to history, who owns a fork in secret, tucked away in a travel chest. He only uses it when no one else is watching, to eat honeyed pears. Apparently, he hates sticky fingers. You imagine him, fork in one hand, prayer beads in the other, wrestling with guilt and sugar. Meanwhile, the aristocracy remains divided. You attend another feast, and there's a palpable tension in the room. Someone whispers, "She has one." She brought it. Sure enough, a young noblewoman removes a small silver fork from her sleeve and begins delicately dissecting a figure. Her mother elbows her under the table, not so subtly. Across the hall, a priest narrows his eyes. You shift uncomfortably in your seat and wonder if you've stumbled into the most dramatic dining room in Europe. Quirky tidbit alert: some clergy reportedly advised their flocks to eat only with their right hand, as the left was considered impure. So, Not only should you avoid forks, but you had to navigate a one-handed eating ritual while balancing stew and decorum. You attempt it once at a tavern. The result is a lap full of lentils and a barkeep who snickers so hard he nearly drops his jug of mead. But the opposition is starting to crack. Not openly, not yet, but the more the church rails against the fork, the more curious people become. It's the oldest story in the book. Tell someone they can't have something, and suddenly it's the only thing they want. A nobleman you meet in Florence confesses to having ordered a set of forks from a Venetian silversmith. "For my wife," he claims. But you can tell by the way he describes them, balanced, elegant, polished to a shine, that he's already picked out his favorite. Historians still argue whether the church's influence truly delayed the fork's spread or whether it simply provided convenient cover for snobbery and status quo worship. But either way, a pattern is forming. The more decadent and elite the setting, the more likely you are to see a fork peeking from someone's robe or tucked beside a goblet. Then comes the death blow, or so it seems. When Theodora, our original Golden Fork heroine, dies of illness not long after her controversial table debut, several conservative clerics publicly declare it a divine punishment. That's right. They say she died because of her vanity, and her fork. You try not to roll your eyes. It's a tragic loss wrapped in petty religious spin. But people listen. People always listen when fear wears a robe and speaks in parables. Suddenly, the fork isn't just suspect, it's cursed. You walk the streets of Venice and hear gossip swirl like wood smoke. A merchant swears he saw a fork slip off a table and stab a dog in the paw. A noble claims his cousin's new silver forks gave everyone stomach worms. Someone suggests they vibrate slightly in the presence of sin. You can't decide whether to laugh or check your pouch for garlic and holy water. And yet, despite all this, despite sermons, suspicion, and supposed curses, the fork doesn't disappear. It lingers, hiding, waiting, and, in the most ironic twist of all, it's being protected by the very people who publicly condemn it. Forks become whispered status symbols. You hear someone at a tavern mutter, "She eats like a Byzantine," and everyone nods, knowing exactly what that means. You leave the chapel. The chants fade behind you. The priest's words echo in your mind, absurd and solemn at once. You know change is slow. And this little tool, this harmless, elegant prong, is going to have to survive a whole lot of sermonizing before it gets a seat at the table. You walk briskly through the cobbled streets of Florence now, a few decades after Theodora's golden fork stirred up such divine drama. The air is warm, the wine flows freely, and the Renaissance is just beginning to flirt with the Italian imagination. Something is shifting here, not just in art and architecture, but in how people think, and how they eat. You're headed to a dinner that's rumored to be different, though no one dares explain what that means aloud. You arrive at a modest villa perched on a hillside. Inside, candlelight flickers across polished wood and painted ceilings. It's not a palace, not exactly, but there's a quiet wealth here. Musicians hum soft chords in the corner, and the food smells like it was blessed by a choir of angels. Fig tart, boar stew, cinnamon pears. And there, glinting gently beside the spoons and knives, is the forbidden object, a fork. Not golden, not bejeweled, just simple silver with two slender tines. You notice one at each place setting. The hostess, a bold woman named Caterina, smiles at your surprise. She leans close and whispers, "Italians are done pretending." You believe her. Italy is starting to rebel, not with swords, but with etiquette. You see, they've grown tired of greasy sleeves and judgmental priests. Tired of ducking under moral accusations just to enjoy a figure. So quietly, fork by fork, noble households begin to shift. Not with fanfare, but with a kind of delicious stealth. It starts in Venice and Florence, naturally, where traders and thinkers come home with new ideas and new dining habits. Historians still argue whether this Italian acceptance was driven by Eastern influence or sheer practicality. Either way, here in Florence, forks are becoming normal. Not for peasants, of course. Don't be ridiculous. But among the literate, the well-traveled, and the well-fed, the fork's exile is ending. You sit at Caterina's table and notice how effortlessly people use them. No trembling. No sideways glances. No bishops foaming at the mouth. Just clean bites and confident hands. There's a rhythm to it now, left hand for the fork, right for the knife, then a graceful dance to the mouth. No sticky fingers. No gravy trails. Just elegance. Still, not everyone is comfortable. At the far end of the table, an older gentleman insists on using his hands, muttering something about the old ways. His fingers glisten with duck fat. His bread trenchers are soaked. You can see the younger guests trying not to cringe. But even he can't deny the appeal. You watch as he eyes a nearby fork, hesitates, then slowly, almost secretly, reaches for it. He pokes a slice of roasted quince. It slides onto his plate without mess. He doesn't speak of it again, but by dessert, the fork is still in his hand. Quirky fork fact for you: some early forks in Italy were made from coral. Not for the rich, oddly enough, but for babies, used as teething tools and talismans against evil spirits. Turns out even a medieval toddler had better dining gear than most European nobles. The shift is slow, but undeniable. You hear that Pope Clement V had a fork collection. You're not sure if that's a sign of papal progress or just papal privilege, but either way, it's progress. Florence's elite begin to give forks as wedding gifts, nestled in velvet boxes beside rings and rosaries. One merchant even starts engraving initials on them. You hold one and feel its weight, a strange balance of rebellion and refinement. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance mindset, obsessed with form, grace, and control, was the true catalyst for the fork's rise. But there's no denying the vibe. The same culture that birthed Botticelli and Da Vinci is now embracing a more elegant way to handle meat. You go to another dinner next week, and this time, no one whispers about the forks. They're simply there, like salt or bread. The host, a painter with powdered sleeves, even cracks a joke about sparing the perfect bite. You laugh, then glance around the room, realizing no one's making the sign of the cross anymore before touching a fork. The fear is fading. The rebellion is working. And it's not just aristocrats. A few educated merchants begin to follow suit, bringing forks to meetings over lunch, tucking them into satchels like Lucky Charms. You hear of one traveling cloth trader who carries a collapsible fork in a leather sheath. For hygiene, he says. You nod knowingly. For the aesthetic, more like. You return to Caterina's villa once more, months later, and this time, even the servants use forks. Not because they must, but because it's simply better. You watch a young maid cut through a fig tart without soiling her apron, and you wonder how anyone still eats any other way. The best part? No sermons. No scoldings. Just soft music, clean plates, and the faint sound of progress clinking against porcelain. You leave the dinner with a fork in your hand, not stolen, just borrowed. A symbol. A tool. A tiny declaration that something so ordinary can be revolutionary when you use it in a world not yet ready. You're walking through the narrow, damp streets of Milan now, the year somewhere in the mid-14th century, and the air feels heavy. Not just with the stink of waste tossed from windows or the faint scent of garlic clinging to tavern walls, but with something darker. You pass boarded-up doors marked with crude black crosses. You hear weeping behind shutters. And just like that, the fork no longer matters. The Black Death has arrived. The plate crashes into Europe like a scythe through tall grass. Entire cities crumble under its weight. One week you're eating dinner with the merchant class in Genoa, marveling at their silverware. The next, half the guests are gone. You blink, and entire neighborhoods are silent. Forks go unused. Tables stay empty. The world stops, gasping, grieving, waiting. But you survive. Somehow. And as you emerge, the world has changed. Not in the way you expect, not yet, but something's loosened. Traditions once held tight are starting to slip. You can feel it in the kitchens, where recipes are rewritten out of necessity. You feel it in the markets, where food and customs now blend in strange new ways. You see it, too, in the dining room, where forks, though still rare, haven't vanished entirely. Here's the strange twist: the Black Death, horrific as it is, may have helped the fork survive. Not by popular demand, but through disruption. The people who clung hardest to the old ways, many of them are gone. The rules, the hierarchy, the invisible etiquette police, they're all thinner now, softer around the edges. In this broken silence, there's space for new habits to take root. Historians still argue whether the plague directly impacted the fork's rise or whether its chaos simply created room for it to grow unnoticed. But either way, it didn't kill the fork. It cleared a path. You're at a small countryside wedding now, a year after the worst of it. It's not lavish, but there's joy. Laughter. Bread and cheese and wine. You spot a fork at the bride's plate, just one. Iron, plain, and slightly bent. But it's there. No one gasps. No one invokes Satan. It's just part of the moment, like the garland in her hair or the way the groom won't stop smiling. There's something poignant about it. A tool once mocked for being unnatural now rests comfortably among grief-worn survivors. Maybe it's because everyone's hands feel more fragile. Maybe it's the newfound obsession with cleanliness. After all, the plague has made people hyper-aware of filth. You can't stop scrubbing your fingers. Water bowls at dinner are no longer quaint, they're essential. Quirky fact, in some towns post-plague, forks were encouraged not for etiquette, but for hygiene. Yes, hygiene. People didn't know about bacteria yet, but they understood that touching less meant getting sick less. And forks? They suddenly made sense in that not quite scientific, but totally practical way. Still, adoption is slow. Rural areas remain skeptical. You eat with shepherds who laugh at the idea of a metal claw between them and their mutton. One old man tells you, food tastes better when it fights back. You don't argue. But in cities, the needle moves. Artisans begin to make forks, not many, not yet, but enough. Some come with hand-carved handles. Some are etched with initials. They're still luxury items, still whispers of class. But they're not shocking anymore. You're invited to a nobleman's estate outside Bologna. The host, grieving 3 sons lost to the plague, has embraced change like a lifeline. His dining table is set with modest forks beside every plate. He doesn't mention them. He doesn't have to. When the soup arrives, people still use spoons. But when the boar is carved, everyone reaches for their forks without hesitation. It's not a statement. It's a comfort. Historians still argue whether this quiet shift reflects a cultural break or just a collective shrug. Either way, the fork is gaining ground. And this time, it's not because of fashion or scandal. It's survival. In some houses, you see forks placed alongside rosaries, part practical tool, part prayer. One widow shows you her husband's fork, wrapped in cloth and stored beside his letters. He always hated greasy fingers, she says. You nod, feeling the weight of grief and progress mingling on the edge of a smile. A merchant from Verona tells you he now exports forks to France. Small orders, he shrugs. But steady. You picture crates of forks bumping along dirt roads, crossing borders quietly, making their way into places where they once sparked outrage. You imagine someone unwrapping one and thinking, this again? But this time, maybe with curiosity. You attend another wedding, another feast, another night in a half-rebuilt world. And at each table, forks appear more frequently. Not flashy, not golden, just normal. The world hasn't fully embraced them yet, but no one's trying to burn them either. You pick one up. Simple. Iron. Cool to the touch. It doesn't feel like rebellion anymore. It feels like recovery. Like something people can control, hold, and share when so much else has slipped through their fingers. And so, amid the ashes of a world undone by disease, you begin to see the outlines of the future, one dainty, useful little poke at a time. The plague retreats like a bad dream, leaving Europe groggy and changed. You find yourself in France now, sometime in the 15th century, standing inside the gilded court of a noble house in Lyon. And despite all the quiet gains the fork has made in Italy, here in France, it's as if nothing happened. People still eat with their fingers, or with a knife if they're feeling particularly ceremonial. Your fingers twitch toward your belt, where your own modest little fork is tucked away, and used and unwelcome. You glance around the feast table and see lavish dishes, pheasant, duck, hare and wine sauce, all served on pewter plates. The aroma is divine. The manners? Not so much. A duke licks his thumb before tearing into a roasted partridge. A baroness dips bread directly into a communal stew. People wipe their hands on the nearest cloth, or in one case, a dog. That's not a joke. You actually see a woman use her lapdog as a living napkin. It's all strangely refined in its own barbaric way. The French court prides itself on sophistication, but when it comes to dining, they're suspiciously stubborn. And it's not that they don't know about the fork. They do. Italian ambassadors brought them. So did merchants. But somehow, here, they're treated like unwanted guests. Like that cousin who brings a lute to every family dinner and insists on singing. Historians still argue whether French resistance to the fork stemmed from nationalism, tradition, or simple culinary snobbery. Likely a swirl of all three. The French love their customs, especially when it comes to food. And if a foreign utensil threatens their buttery, sauce-drenched rituals, well, prepare for a long, passive-aggressive resistance. You sit next to a court poet who leans over and confides, "They say the fork takes the romance out of eating." You look down at your duck leg, dripping with juice, and wonder how romantic greasy knuckles are supposed to be. To their credit, the French have elevated hand-eating to an art. There's an entire etiquette surrounding it: how to tear bread silently, how to dip without double dipping, how to use only 3 fingers to show restraint. It's like watching a ballet of flour and meat. But even so, you can't help but notice how often people excuse themselves to wash up. There's constant dabbing, wiping, and awkward finger sniffing. Quirky tidbit incoming: France at this time had an obsession with perfumed gloves. That's right, gloves soaked in lavender, orange blossom, even civet. Because if your hands are going to smell after dinner, they may as well smell fancy. Forks, you think, would solve this. But try saying that aloud, and you'll be laughed all the way to Calais. You hear rumors of one noblewoman who dares to use a fork in Paris. Her table is whispered about in salons and Somme. Some call her elegant. Others say she's cold, mechanical, distant, like a machine that eats. One dinner guest swears she used the fork to clean her fingernails between courses. Another insists she stabbed a grape so hard it shot across the room. The truth, of course, is probably far duller. But scandal loves cutlery. Meanwhile, the king's household remains unflinchingly old school. You attend a royal feast where everything from oysters to cherries is fingered, sucked, or sliced with a dagger. You watch a bishop pop a pear in his mouth whole, chewing as if defending the faith one bite at a time. You slowly push your fork farther into your sleeve, like a heretic concealing forbidden scripture. Historians still argue whether the French truly hated forks or just didn't see the point. After all, the food was often soft enough to scoop, or tender enough to pull apart. Why complicate it? Why change? But beneath the gold-embroidered sleeves and perfumed airs, you spot the cracks. Servants groan about laundry stained with berry juice. Kitchen staff whisper about how forks might make plating easier, cleaner. You overhear a young noble asking a cook to fashion a few forks just to try. Quietly. Discreetly. Maybe for dessert. Maybe just for guests from Venice. It's the tiniest foothold, but you see it. A chef, experimenting. A servant, polishing prongs. A merchant, casually mentioning that forks are quite fashionable across the Alps. The idea is there now. Floating. Tantalizing. Like a rumor no one can fully ignore. At one dinner, a scholar from Avignon tells you about a letter he read from Florence describing a table where no hands touched meat. He pauses dramatically, sips his wine, then adds, "Of course, that's just gossip." But the glint in his eye says otherwise. People are curious. The walls are high, but someone's been carving a little door in the back. You meet a teenage noble, newly back from studying in Padua. He shows you a small wooden fork he brought home. "My tutor used one," he says. "I liked it." He hides it in a pouch like a relic. You ask if he plans to use it here. He shrugs. "Not yet." And there it is again, "Not yet." You're starting to love those words. Even so, you eat with your hands tonight. Everyone does. You tear bread, dip cheese, and pray the cherry tart doesn't stain your tunic. But when you leave, you notice something tucked in the host's sideboard. Not on display. Not bragged about. Just there. One fork. Silver. Waiting. France isn't ready. But it's listening. And somewhere beneath the pride and powdered wigs, you sense it. The future is quietly sharpening its tines. You wake to the soft hum of lute strings and the distant smell of ink and hot bread. Welcome to 15th century Italy, where everything, including eating, is starting to get a dramatic flair. The Renaissance is officially in full swing now. You're no longer just walking through history, you're strutting through it in embroidered slippers, dodging marble statues and passionate monologues about beauty, symmetry, and the soul. And as minds open to new ideas about art, science, and the very shape of the universe, you watch something else slip quietly into favor: the fork. You're at a banquet hosted by a Florentine artist, someone whose name you can't pronounce but whose studio has been churning out nudes, angels, and idealized elbows for years. The long wooden table gleams with ceramics. Wine sparkles in glass. And beside every plate, a fork. Not hidden. Not whispered about. Just there. You try not to gawk. This is what quiet revolution looks like. Historians still argue whether it was artists or scholars who gave the fork its social license, but one thing's clear, it fits the aesthetic. The fork, with its slender lines and balanced design, is a Renaissance object through and through. Just look at it. It's not just useful, it's beautiful. A sculptor you meet later even claims it's the perfect utensil of divine proportion. He says this while eating melon cubes in a toga. You try to take him seriously. You find that more and more intellectuals are tying the fork to a broader idea of civility. It's not just about manners, it's about mastery. Mastery over nature. Over the self. A man who can spear a grape without smearing his sleeve is clearly more advanced than one who bites into a pear and lets juice drip down his chin. Or so the argument goes. At one philosophical salon, a professor gives an impromptu lecture on the symbolism of cutlery. Knives, he says, are violence. Spoons are submission. But the fork? The fork is balance. You clap politely, then realize he's still going. You get invited to a dinner party hosted by an eccentric poet who insists that every course be eaten with a different fork. He has 9. One is carved from ivory. Another made of gold-plated bronze, bent slightly, he claims, by Dante's ghost. The food is good, but watching people switch forks between courses feels like dinner with a magician who keeps pulling rabbits out of your soup. But the message is clear, the fork is in fashion. Not just as a tool, but as an accessory, a marker of taste, a conversation piece. You see handles carved with mythological scenes. Tines shaped like flames. Some are so fancy they barely function. You pick one up and wonder if you're meant to eat with it or cast spells. Quirky fact time. In Venice, a particularly fashionable noblewoman commissions a fork shaped like a mermaid, complete with a mother-of-pearl tail. She uses it only for olives and claims it keeps her fingers from smelling fishy. It's both ridiculous and genius. Of course, not everyone loves the showmanship. You meet an elderly merchant who grumbles about fork people and their tiny aristocratic bites. He tears into his meat with both hands like he's mad at it. But even he carries a small fork tucked into his satchel. 4 figs, he says. Too sticky otherwise. You notice how the fork slowly infiltrates the middle class, not just nobles and scholars now, but merchants, bankers, and well-dressed lawyers. They start requesting forks at taverns, bringing their own to inns. It's subtle, this spread, like perfume in a crowded room. You can't see it, but it's everywhere. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance truly democratized the fork, or just added more drama to its ascent. But either way, it's moving. Quietly. Elegantly. Fork by fork. You attend a gathering in Rome where the host serves stuffed artichokes. Without forks, the filling would squish out between your fingers like angry cheese. But with forks? Clean precision. The applause is genuine. Someone raises a toast to culinary clarity. It's the most dramatic thing you've ever heard at a vegetable tasting. It's around this time you start seeing forks made in sets, 2 or 4 at a time, bundled with knives and spoons in wooden boxes. A silversmith in Milan tells you can't keep up with the orders. People want to eat like philosophers, he jokes, but they pay like kings. You buy a set. You have no table, no kitchen, but you have the set. It feels like progress. At one memorable dinner, a mathematician uses a fork to gesture wildly while describing the motion of planets. Mid-sentence, he spears a peach cube without even looking and pops it into his mouth. The entire table applauds. Someone jokes that Copernicus would approve. You don't even question the logic. And that's how it feels now. Forks are no longer just tolerated, they're admired. They've passed through scandal, suspicion, and spiritual crisis and come out polished, fashionable, and oddly philosophical. You leave one dinner with wine on your breath and the realization that the fork has finally found its tribe. Poets, dreamers, thinkers, people too busy contemplating beauty to ruin it with gravy hands. You look down at the fork in your palm. 3 prongs. Perfectly balanced. Not a symbol of vanity anymore, or rebellion. Just a sign that maybe, just maybe, civilization's heading somewhere slightly less sticky. You're on the road north now, heading toward the Alps, and you can already feel the Renaissance warmth cooling behind you. As you trudge through increasingly gray villages and mud-slick towns, one thing becomes clear, the fork hasn't conquered all. Not yet. Especially not here, where the land is colder, the customs older, and the hands still very much in charge of dinner. You reach a small inn just outside Zurich, hoping for something hot and maybe, just maybe, a glimpse of cutlery progress. Instead, you get stew in a wooden bowl and a hunk of bread the size of a newborn lamb. The innkeeper plops it down with a grin and not a single utensil in sight. You glance at your fork, packed neatly in your satchel, and keep it there. This, clearly, is not the moment. But what surprises you isn't the lack of forks, it's the fierce loyalty to spoons and knives. In this region, spoons are practically sacred. Each household has its own, passed down like family heirlooms. Knives, too, are cherished tools, often personalized with initials or curious engravings. You meet one baker who eats every meal with a spoon carved from cherrywood and claims it tastes sweeter than metal. You don't argue. He's holding it like a weapon. Historians still argue whether these regions resisted the fork out of isolation or tradition. Probably both. The mountain passes make trade slow, and with it, the trickle of new ideas. But also, people here like the way they eat. It's practical. It's warm. It's rustic in a way that feels intentional, not backward. And then there's the food. Thick soups. Soft cheeses. Roasted roots. Not exactly fork-friendly. You try eating a potato with your fork one night and it splits awkwardly, launching a hot chunk onto the lap of a nearby merchant. He doesn't even blink. Just wipes it off and continues with his spoon like nothing happened. You're starting to understand something important. The fork isn't replacing other utensils. It's competing with them. And in these parts, the spoon is king. Even in noble homes, where gold goblets sparkle and tapestries stretch across every wall, you see spoons and knives resting proudly on silver trays. Forks? Maybe one or two, tucked away like novelty toys. At one dinner, you meet a nobleman who proudly announces that he has never used a fork. Too fussy, he says, slicing his sausage with the precision of a surgeon and scooping up cabbage with his knife's flat side. A real man eats with a blade. Then he accidentally flicks gravy onto his sleeve and spends 10 minutes trying to pretend it didn't happen. Quirky tidbit, in some parts of Switzerland, people believed forks were bad luck at weddings, because anything that pierces food might also pierce a union. So newlyweds ate with their hands, grinning through fingers slick with honey and stew, hoping it'd bring lifelong happiness. You eat with them once. Your fingers stick together for hours. But slowly, you notice signs. Tiny ones. A merchant from Milan passing through with a small silver fork dangling from his waist. A mayor's wife asking her cook if that Florentine thing might make apple tarts easier to serve. A craftsman selling forks at a market, not prominently, but not secretly either. You linger at his stall. His forks are simple, iron, hand-beaten, with handles wrapped in cloth. Selling well, you ask. He shrugs. They don't laugh as much as they used to. Historians still argue whether this region's spoon culture truly stunted the fork's spread or simply gave it a harder climb. Either way, it's clear now, the fork isn't the inevitable future. It has rivals. Loyal ones. Practical ones. And sometimes, better-suited ones. You find yourself at a winter feast in a German town nestled along the Rhine. The room is warm from firelight and mead. The table is groaning with pork and sauerkraut, dumplings, and dark bread. You're handed a spoon and a knife. No one even pretends to look for a fork. You start to wonder, maybe this place doesn't need one. But then dessert comes. Poached pears and cinnamon syrup. Slippery. Hot. Difficult. You instinctively reach for your fork and glance around. No one reacts. So you take it out. Gently. Quietly. And with a soft scrape, you lift the pear, clean and elegant. The man beside you, an older farmer with gravy on his cuffs, leans in and whispers, "I saw one of those in Venice." Then he watches your fork like it might cast a spell. The moment passes. You eat. He eats. No one says another word. But you leave the table with the sense that a seed's been planted. One tavern. One dessert. One curious glance. That's all it takes. The fork hasn't won here. But it's made itself known. Like a polite traveler at the door, uninvited, but not unwelcome. And as you step back out into the frost and hear the distant clink of dishes being washed inside, you wonder if someday even these spoon strongholds will relent. Not from pressure. Not from fashion. But from something far simpler. Convenience. You arrive in Paris again, and this time, something's changed. The air still smells like bread and old stone, the streets are still filled with the clatter of hooves and gossip, but underneath the bustle, there's a faint metallic ring at the table. The fork, after all this time, is beginning to creep into royal hands. Slowly, secretly, and always with a side of shame. It starts, as many things in France do, behind closed doors. You're inside the residence of King Henry III, that famously fastidious monarch with an eye for fashion and a deep, spiritual hatred of mess. The king, so the rumor goes, bathes more often than any ruler before him and once fainted at the sight of mustard on a doublet. You're told this is the man to watch if you want to see the fork finally catch on in Paris. And there it is. Not on full display, mind you. Tucked next to his plate, polished and thin, its tines slightly curved. The king picks at a fig with the fork, almost like a nervous habit. He doesn't talk about it. No one does. You just notice the way everyone pretends not to look. Historians still argue whether Henry III truly loved the fork or merely tolerated it for the sake of his spotless cuffs. Either way, he's using it. And that's enough. Because when a king so much as sneezes differently, the court changes handkerchiefs. You start to see forks appear in nobles' homes, not many, and not proudly, but there. But here's the catch, they don't admit it. You attend a dinner where a viscount uses a fork for oysters, then immediately switches back to spoon and knife for everything else. Just for slippery things, he says. You nod. Of course. Who would dare imply a fork might be used for meat? You sit beside a young marquise who whispers, they say the Spanish mock us for it. You ask if she cares. She glances at her lap, where a delicate fork rests on a silk napkin, and replies, not at all. Then she shovels an roasted pear with it and wipes her mouth like it's the most scandalous thing she's done all week. Quirky historical tidbit, Henry III is also rumored to have a personal fork-bearer. A servant whose entire job is to polish and present the king's fork at meals. This man reportedly carried it in a velvet pouch embroidered with lilies. You wonder if the fork felt smug inside it. Still, the resistance isn't gone. You dine with a Parisian bishop who refuses to sit at the same table as a fork. Unnatural, he mutters. Like eating with a comb. He uses 2 knives, expertly levering food from one blade to his mouth like a fencing champion. His sleeves are soaked by the end. You resist the urge to offer him a napkin. Historians still argue whether French pride or papal politics played a larger role in slowing the fork's adoption. But now, with the royal seal of quiet approval, the slope is greased. You see forks in apothecaries' windows, nestled beside combs and silver pins. Cutlers start selling them as part of dining trios, knife, spoon, and fork. No big announcement. Just quiet, incremental change. And then comes the twist. You attend a private dinner hosted by an Italian ambassador. He brings his own utensils, as expected. But this time, his French guests don't laugh. They copy him. Awkwardly, at first. You watch one man hold a fork like it's about to bite him back. Another tries to use it for soup. But it's happening. They're trying. The ambassador smiles like a man who planted a tree 10 years ago and is finally seeing fruit. One night, you overhear a poet at a tavern declare, a man who eats with a fork must have secrets. Everyone laughs. But later, when dessert arrives, that same poet produces a tiny silver fork from his cloak and uses it to eat candied plums, eyes daring anyone to call him out. No one does. At a baker's stand, a woman tells you she's seen forks in wedding dowries. The groom's family wanted her to stop wiping her hands on curtains, she explains. You nod solemnly. That seems like reason enough. Even the servants are noticing. A footman at a noble estate mutters, easier to clean plates when no one's pawed the roast. You can't argue with that logic. A maid shows you how to stack forks properly, prongs facing up, always, and says she hopes her next employer uses them too. No more fingernails full of pheasant, she adds. Again, hard to argue. You walk the markets of Paris and see more signs, forks made of brass, pewter, iron. Not just for kings now. Not just for secrets. But for sale. For use. Still, it's not universal. You stop at a country tavern and ask for a fork. The owner squints at you and brings a pitchfork. You both laugh, but only one of you means it. But back in the city, things are different. The fork is no longer a threat. It's a curiosity. An option. And then, one morning, a Parisian noblewoman uses it at a garden brunch, in full view of the press, the poets, and the painters. She eats a strawberry. No one faints. No one curses. Someone claps. And with that, The fork has crossed the final threshold. Not hidden, not whispered about, not tiptoeing around pride or piety. Just used. You sail across the channel now, the salty wind tugging at your cloak as England's misty shore emerges through the fog. You step onto a damp dock, boots crunching over gravel and fish bones, and within moments you can tell, forks haven't made it here. Not even a little. You've left behind the subtle whispers of Florentine elegance and Parisian hesitation. Welcome to England, land of damp ale, chunky bread, and bare-knuckled roast beast. Inside a local tavern near Dover, you watch a man scoop mashed turnips with his hand and smear them directly onto bread before biting into it like a construction worker devouring drywall. Another smears gravy with a dagger onto meat and doesn't even flinch when it drips down his chin. You ask the innkeeper if she's seen a fork before. She laughs so hard she snorts. "We've got spoons," she says, like it's a flex. This isn't resistance. This is oblivion. Historians still argue whether England truly ignored the fork or whether its slow arrival was part of broader cultural stubbornness. But you can see the truth plain as day. Here, eating with your hands isn't just normal. It's patriotic. You dine with a merchant who traveled to France and whispers, almost shamefully, that he used a fork there. "It was odd," he says, staring into his beef stew like it betrayed him. "Felt like fencing with my dinner." Then he carves a turnip with the same knife he used to clean his fingernails. The aristocracy is only marginally more refined. You attend a banquet at a noble's estate, and though the hall is dripping in tapestries and gold-leafed everything, the dining is gloriously medieval. Knives slash through roast meats. Bread trenchers soak up grease and are tossed to the hounds when soggy. The concept of a clean bite is a foreign myth here, probably French. One lord boasts that he once saw a Venetian ambassador eating with a tiny pitchfork. He laughs so hard he spills wine down his doublet. The room joins in. Someone says, "What's next? Napkins?" The laughter doubles. You press your fork tighter inside your coat. Quirky tidbit, Shakespeare's plays often describe feasts, banquets, and drunken revelry, but never a fork. Not once. Historians love pointing this out, as if it confirms England's steadfast commitment to finger food in existential chaos. Still, you catch glimpses. At a printing shop in London, a young apprentice shows you a woodcut from an Italian manuscript. The man in the image is holding a fork. "Looks like a devil's claw," he says. "They use those, do they?" You nod. He shakes his head. Weird. Even at the royal court, where fashion is borrowed from France, cutlery customs lag behind. You attend a feast at Elizabeth I's palace, all velvet and pearls and poetry, and yet every hand is wrapped around poultry legs and pears. Graceful, yes, but still greasy. The queen dabs at her lips with a lace cloth and delicately sips wine. Then she tears a cherry tart apart with her fingers. Historians still argue whether this national pride in earthy dining was rebellion against the continent or simply inertia in satin gloves. Either way, England becomes the final stronghold. The last to hold out. But then, quietly, cracks begin to show. A noblewoman returns from France with an ornate travel set, spoon, knife, and fork. She hosts small dinners, continental style. At first it's mocked, derided as foreign and fussy, but slowly, a few guests ask where she got hers. A cutler in Norwich begins offering a third piece as a novelty item. Forks appear in noble children's dowries. One scholar writes an essay, dry, overly long, but earnest, on the philosophical merits of tidiness at table. You hear of a fork spotted at Cambridge. Then two at Oxford. A bishop in York, reportedly very private, owns four. A poet writes a love sonnet using fork metaphors, and though it's terrible, people remember it. The idea is no longer ridiculous. Just new. You have dinner with a printer in London who owns a fork carved from horn. He uses it only for quince paste and insists it's more refined that way. But not for meat, he clarifies quickly. That's what God gave hands for. You smile and nod, as always. Then one night, you're invited to a foreign envoy's home. Half English, half Italian, well-traveled and well-fed. You sit at a table where each place setting includes a fork. Not gold, not silver, just sturdy iron. The guests are mostly English, but no one laughs. No one protests. They just eat, quietly, comfortably. And you realize you've been waiting for this moment. It's not a revolution. It's not even a trend. It's a quiet shift. A single dinner that feels like a hinge in the story. Because for the first time in England, forks are not scandal, not punchline, not novelty. They're just normal. You're still in England, but things have cooled again, politically, socially, and, unfortunately, culinarily. You're at a manor house in Yorkshire now, where the air is damp and the food is plentiful. But progress? Not so much. Just when you thought the fork was making headway, England pulls one of its classic moves, suspicion. Not from the common folk, no, they're too busy slurping broth from wooden bowls to care. No, the fear comes from the nobility. The educated. The ones who should know better. You attend a dinner with an earl whose wig is taller than most toddlers. The table is long, the candles are tall, and the menu is aggressively English, blood pudding, game pie, boiled everything. No forks in sight. You politely ask the steward, and he looks at you as though you've requested to duel a duck. You've entered the era of foreign fork fear. Not an official term, but one you feel suits the moment well. The fork, now faintly associated with France and even more so with Italy, is getting wrapped up in a different kind of scandal, nationalism. This is post-Reformation England. Suspicion of anything papist or foreign is at an all-time high. You could serve someone a slice of pie on a plate shaped like the Queen's crown and still be accused of continental sympathies if you use a fork to do it. Historians still argue whether this backlash was fueled by religious paranoia or sheer cultural stubbornness. Either way, the fork gets caught in the crossfire. People don't just reject it for being odd. They reject it because it smells like the Vatican and tastes like betrayal. You overhear a priest muttering that the fork separates man from his food too much. How can you feel your bread if you stab it like a criminal? He asks. Is it still nourishment, or has it become theater? You wonder the same thing when he drops a hot turnip into his lap 5 minutes later. Quirky tidbit, some English physicians of the day believed that eating with forks caused a coldness in the digestion because metal utensils lack the natural warmth of hands. So yes, now forks are not only foreign, but they're also apparently giving people tummy troubles. You sit through countless meals where forks are mocked outright. A group of Cambridge scholars performs a comedic sketch where a Frenchman eats with a fork and gets arrested by a talking sausage. The room roars with laughter. You try to smile. The sausage winks at you. At one estate, the lady of the house reveals her fork set only after the drapes are drawn and the servants dismissed. We use them for pears, she whispers. Only pears. Don't want to appear too modern. She hands you a fork made of tortoiseshell and silver. You eat the pear in silence. It tastes like secrecy. Yet even in this climate, the fork doesn't vanish. It lurks. It survives. It shows up in places people pretend not to notice. Like the letter of a nobleman who mentions eating with a triple tine in Venice, casually, like it's a travel anecdote, not a confession. Or the cookbook that includes a diagram of a properly set table, featuring a fork drawn in pencil, half erased, like someone tried to smuggle it in between spoon and knife. You attend a gathering in London where a traveler from Constantinople brings his own silverware. He eats calmly with his fork while the English guests glance sideways, chewing their beef like suspicious squirrels. No one says anything. But later, you hear someone mutter, "Seems unnatural, don't it? Food shouldn't be stabbed." Still, there's always that one guest, the outlier. At a countryside ball, a young gentleman named Tobias brings a fork and uses it proudly. "My tutor taught me," he explains. "Said it was the civil way." Someone snorts. Another sneers. But no one stops him. By dessert, 2 others are asking where he bought it. You give him a nod. He doesn't notice, but it feels important. Historians still argue whether the upper class delayed the fork's rise out of fear or fashion. Probably both. But there's something else, too, pride. A deeply English pride in doing things the way they've always been done. Even if that means licking your fingers through gravy and wiping them on your cravat. But even fear wears thin with time. You notice that the very people who once mocked the fork begin to admire it, first in foreign guests, then in neighbors, and finally, begrudgingly, in themselves. They won't admit it, of course. But they'll ask you how to hold it. They'll offer you one as an experiment. And one day, you walk into a home and find a fork already laid at your place setting, no questions asked. You think back to that innkeeper who laughed at you in Dover. You wonder if she's still alive, still slapping spoons on tables and calling it good enough. Or maybe, just maybe, she's tried it by now. Maybe she liked it. The fork in England still isn't beloved. It's not a symbol of grace or sophistication. but it's no longer feared. And in this land of pageantry, stubbornness, and pies so dense they could stop arrows, that's a victory. One bite at a time, the fork is carving out its place. It's a foggy spring morning in London, the kind where chimney smoke hangs like lace over rooftops, and you're stepping into a drawing room where a peculiar kind of courage is about to be tested. You've been invited to a small dinner, just 8 guests, a modest roast, and, daringly, a matching set of forks brought in from Florence. Your host, a minor noble with more curiosity than caution, places one beside each plate with the air of a man preparing for a duel. No fanfare. No explanation. Just polished silver and silent anticipation. You sit, hands folded, watching as the guests enter. Their eyes dart to the table, widen slightly, then return to polite neutral. One clears his throat. Another gently shifts her napkin over the fork as if hiding a scandalous letter. But no one leaves. That alone tells you everything. You've reached the moment of cautious adoption, the part of the story where people stop laughing, stop fearing, and begin testing. Slowly. Quietly. Like dipping a toe into a suspiciously warm bath. Historians still argue whether these early adopters in England were rebels or simply bored. Maybe both. But here they are, aristocrats, intellectuals, and ambitious social climbers who've decided the fork might not be the Antichrist after all. Dinner begins. There's mutton, peas, and a flaky vegetable tart. The first course is met with a dilemma. Do you reach for the fork or pretend it isn't there? Your host solves it for everyone by picking his up casually and stabbing a pea. The room exhales. You hear the soft clink of others following suit. And just like that, the fork has entered English dining, not with trumpets, not with revolutions, but with the quiet grace of peer pressure. Across the table, a gentleman named Mr. Harrow handles his fork like it might combust. He jabs at his meat with all the finesse of a man cleaning his chimney. But he's trying. You give him credit. Midway through the meal, he sets it down and finishes with his knife. Baby steps. Quirky fact for you, some early English dining manuals began including fork etiquette in the margins around this time, though awkwardly. One suggests you avoid thrusting with too much vigor, lest the meat fly from the plate. Another reminds ladies not to speak with the tines visible in hand. You picture a drawing room full of fork-wielding nobles fencing over pudding and chuckle under your breath. You visit a cutler in Sheffield and find that forks are now available in sets, not just imports, but locally made. Iron, mostly. Sometimes brass. Plain, but sturdy. The cutler shrugs. Can't say I like him. But the sons of barons keep asking. He sells you a pair wrapped in oilcloth and wishes you luck. In the city's merchant circles, forks are becoming fashionable. Not common, heavens no, but fashionable. You attend a dinner hosted by a banker who recently returned from the continent. His table is impeccable, his wine imported, his forks engraved. We must eat like the Italians, he says with a grin, since we owe them half our money anyway. The joke lands, but you catch several guests eyeing his fork technique like students at a fencing match. Even Queen Elizabeth I's court begins to flirt with the idea. A courtier you meet confesses that Her Majesty has a fork, singular, kept for sweetmeats and quince paste. She doesn't use it often, he says, but it's there. Like a royal guard. Or a fashion emergency. Still, there's backlash. A popular pamphlet circulates through London claiming that forks suck the soul from the feast. Dramatic, but memorable. A bishop rails in a sermon that eating with prongs is an offense to the intimacy of nourishment. You're impressed. That sentence is both ridiculous and oddly poetic. But here's the truth, the more the elite flirt with forks, the more they trickle down. You meet a tailor who dines with apprentices using forks carved from whalebone. Helps with the stew, he says. Also keeps the butter off our cuffs. You meet a bookseller who owns just one fork, polished to a shine and wrapped in velvet. He uses it for pears and cheese. Mostly when I'm alone, he confides. Historians still argue whether this phase marked the beginning of full adoption or just a passing trend. But the signs are everywhere. In kitchens, servants learn to polish forks alongside goblets. In cookbooks, recipes begin suggesting items which may be lifted. In etiquette guides, forks shift from scandal to suggestion. You attend one final meal this season, this time hosted by a playwright whose name hasn't been written yet, but whose wit is unmistakable. The guests are artists, merchants, a few noble cousins, and a curious foreign scholar. The table is set with matching forks. No one gasps. No one hides theirs under the napkin. They eat. They talk. They laugh. You realize something. This isn't a moment anymore. It's a pattern. And somewhere between the clink of cutlery and the hum of conversation, the fork stops being foreign. It just becomes part of dinner. You step onto the damp wooden planks of a Boston dock, the smell of salt and tobacco mixing with sawdust and boiled corn. You're in the new world now, raw, restless, and barely cobbled together. If you thought forks had a hard time breaking into France or England, you haven't tried dinner in colonial America. Here, in a land of survival and suspicion, the fork isn't just foreign, it's almost non-existent. You sit at a long pine table in a Massachusetts farmhouse. A fire crackles in the hearth, and a pot of something thick and beige bubbles above it. The food is hearty: corn mush, stewed pork, apples boiled into submission. Everyone eats with a spoon, a knife, and hands. The utensils are crude, handmade, and often shared. The closest thing to a fork you see is a two-pronged roasting spit over the fire. You ask about forks and receive blank stares. One woman chuckles, "We're not kings." Another mutters, "Too many sharp things at the table makes a man nervous." You quietly put your own travel fork back in your coat pocket. Historians still argue whether early American settlers rejected forks out of necessity or ideology. The truth likely lies in both. Colonists brought few luxuries with them. Forks, if packed at all, were buried deep beneath salted meat and wool. And once here, their function was quickly dismissed. After all, who needs a fork when everything's boiled, mashed, or skewered? Even at the governor's table, things aren't much fancier. You attend a dinner in Virginia where wine flows, turkey steams, and the guests, nobles, traders, and statesmen, dig in with knives and fingers. One man uses the same blade to slice meat and whittle a toothpick. No one flinches. This is frontier elegance. Quirky tidbit: some colonists used shells, actual clamshells, as spoons. Utensils were improvised, personal, and deeply utilitarian. If it didn't fit in your pocket or double as a weapon, it was probably staying in Europe. And yet, a few forks trickle through. Merchants from France bring them in with wine and silk. Dutch settlers, ever practical, use small forks for sweets and pickled onions. You spot one on the belt of a fur trader, worn beside his flintlock pistol like a badge of civilization. The real turning point, though, begins in the drawing rooms, not in dusty cabins, but in the polished parlors of Boston and Philadelphia, where tea is poured, wigs are powdered, and manners are practiced like religion. You attend a soiree hosted by a widowed Frenchwoman who serves sugared almonds and pastries on porcelain plates. She uses a fork with such ease and grace that the local wives start asking where they can get one. One guest whispers, "Is it Protestant?" Another shrugs. "It's French." "So, no." They giggle, but the next day, you spot one of them inquiring about a silversmith. Historians still argue whether American adoption of the fork was driven by fashion or trade, but in truth, it's the intersection of both. As trade routes widen and more printed materials cross the Atlantic, Americans read about European customs. They see illustrations of elegant table settings. They begin to crave the polish of a culture they both admire and wish to surpass. In Charleston, you visit a plantation where the master boasts of owning a full Italian fork set. "Shipped over in a crate with the Madeira," he says. "Still got the straw." His guests marvel, even as they continue tearing into their chicken with bare hands. One evening in New York, you attend a dinner hosted by a wealthy Dutch merchant. The table is lit by whale oil lamps, and every guest is served with a fork. Not fancy ones, just iron and bone. But the reaction is priceless. A young lawyer fumbles his fork 3 times before managing to stab a piece of squash. He looks up, flushed, and says, "Better than fingers, I think." The room laughs. No one disagrees. You wander further inland and find the fork's journey slows again. In rural Pennsylvania, a blacksmith tells you, forks are for city folk and dandies. You watch him eat pie with a knife and say nothing. His daughter, though, brings out a small wooden fork she carved herself. "I use it for berries," she says quietly. "Less squish." You realize that's how it always begins. One small, practical use. Then another. And another. The colonies may be rough, but they're not immune to refinement. They just take longer to warm up. At a dinner in Annapolis, a preacher blesses the meal, then awkwardly uses a fork to cut his pudding. "Picked it up in London," he explains. still figuring it out. His wife, watching from the corner of her eye, already uses hers like she's been practicing in secret. The fork's not common yet, but it's not strange either. You start noticing it in inventories, alongside pewter spoons and candle molds. You see them in shops near the docks, tucked between buttons and tobacco tins. They appear in wills, listed as my good eating fork. And slowly, they stop needing adjectives. Just forks. You're strolling through the streets of Edinburgh now, wind curling under your cloak, when you feel it, a hum in the air, something sharp and bright beneath the surface. It's the Enlightenment, and it's not subtle. Philosophers are scribbling into the night by candlelight, doctors are arguing about bloodletting versus leeches, and somewhere, a man is writing an angry pamphlet about why muffins should be split with a knife, not fingers. And in the midst of all this heady debate, guess what's getting dragged into the intellectual fray? The fork. Yes, the humble, pointy little eating tool is now being discussed in salons and lecture halls. You wander into a parlor in London where men in powdered wigs are sipping tea and fiercely debating the ethics of utensil use. One says, the fork refines the act of consumption. Another counters, it alienates man from his meat. You blink. The roast beef hasn't even arrived yet. Historians still argue whether Enlightenment thinkers genuinely cared about forks or simply used them as symbols in broader arguments about civility, restraint, and man's dominion over nature. But either way, it's happening. The fork is now philosophical. You sit in on a dinner hosted by a mathematician who insists his fork is the most efficient of all eating instruments. Each time divides the food, reducing effort. It is geometry at the table, he exclaims, gesturing so wildly he flings a pea across the room. A physician nods gravely. Yes, and fewer fingers in shared bowls lowers transmission of disease. The poet beside you sighs and whispers, I just think it's pretty. There's a new hunger for order now. For systems. For manners that reflect rationality. And the fork, clean, symmetrical, functional, is becoming a utensil of choice for those who want to appear enlightened. You watch as one dinner guest holds his fork with surgical precision, cutting his meat into cubes so perfectly uniform it would make Euclid weep. Quirky tidbit, some 18th century thinkers believed that using a fork made you more virtuous. Seriously. They claimed to train the hand to act with patience and care, and thus subtly shape the character. You wonder if anyone's ever actually become a better person from using a fork. Probably not. But they sure like to think so. In Paris, philosophers include fork use in etiquette manuals, right alongside proper hat removal and how not to die from spoiled oysters. In Vienna, a salon hostess famously bans guests who refuse to use forks, calling them mired in the swamp of instinct. It becomes fashionable to sneer at finger eaters, as if their hands are smudged with sin. But, ironically, this new enthusiasm leads to overthinking. You attend a meal where each course comes with a different fork. One for fish, one for meat, one for dessert, one, supposedly, for salad, which you never actually see. The host explains each fork's purpose with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics or royal decrees. You try to keep up but end up buttering your bread with the dessert fork and receive a look that could curdle wine. Still, this formality spreads like wildfire. England, France, Austria, they all begin codifying the way forks should be held, the angle at which they should enter the mouth, whether the tine should point up or down. Dinner becomes choreography. You watch young nobles practicing at mock meals, coached by etiquette masters. One boy cries when he drops a dumpling. His tutor shouts, again. Historians still argue whether this fork obsession was more about manners or social climbing. It's probably both. The fork becomes a kind of status shorthand. If you know how to use one properly, you've clearly been raised right. Or at least taught to pretend. You attend a dinner hosted by a Scottish philosopher who begins the evening with a toast to the fork, our companion in reason, restraint, and the reclamation of gravy. Everyone claps. Someone weeps quietly into a linen napkin. Even among common folk, the fork is now on the radar. In middle-class homes, families save up to buy sets of matching utensils. Children are taught how to eat properly, even if the stew is still made from turnips and hope. You meet a seamstress who keeps her only fork wrapped in fabric and uses it once a week, on Sundays, for boiled eggs. You see them in taverns now, resting beside tankards and sausages. Not always used, but present. You see them in boarding schools, where headmasters force their students to master fork etiquette alongside Latin declensions. You even spot a set in the window of a shop in York, 3-tined forks, polished and gleaming. A man stops beside you, stares at them for a moment, and mutters, "Civilized, that." And it is. That's the point. In the age of reason, people don't just want tools that work. They want tools that say something. And the fork? It says, I think. I measure. I don't lick my hands at dinner. You leave a dinner in Berlin where a lecturer reads a short essay titled "The Fork as Extension of the Rational Will." No one claps. But everyone uses a fork to eat the post-lecture sausages. Progress. The fork has made it. Not just as a utensil, but as an idea. Steam rises in the air now, thick with coal smoke and ambition. You're walking into the clang and hiss of the Industrial Revolution, and it smells like iron, oil, and half-finished empire. The streets are lined with soot-streaked buildings and factories that never sleep, and the people are changing. Faster, sharper, harder. And the fork? The fork is changing with them. You step into a bustling cutlery workshop in Sheffield. Sparks fly, and hammers ring out in rhythm. This is ground zero for what's about to happen, mass production. The fork, once a precious object passed from father to son or hidden in a velvet-lined box, is now being churned out in hundreds, then thousands, then millions. Historians still argue whether industrialization democratized the fork or cheapened it. You stand there watching workers crank out identical utensils with steam-powered efficiency and think, maybe it did both. You hold one, a standard 4-tine dinner fork, stamped out of a sheet of steel, straight as a railway track. It's not elegant. It's not engraved. But it's durable, practical, and it works. And suddenly, that's enough. Forks begin appearing in middle-class households, not as heirlooms, but as defaults. You go to a clerk's modest home in Manchester and find an entire drawer of them. Bought the whole set, he tells you proudly, came with the dinner plates. You don't ask what he paid. It wasn't much. At one point, you visit a warehouse in Birmingham where forks are sorted into wooden bins labeled meat, fish, dessert, pudding, and, your favorite, assorted fancy. That last one includes forks shaped like shells, harps, and even a miniature pitchfork. Irony, it seems, has entered the design process. Quirky tidbit, the 19th century saw the rise of catalog shopping, and forks were among the most popular items ordered. Some catalogs even offered personalized monograms, with promises like "delivered by Christmas," your name in silver. In London, you attend a factory owner's banquet. The plates are ceramic, the candles gaslit, and every guest has not one, not two, but 5 forks arranged before them. You're instructed not to use the wrong one for oysters or risk social exile. Across the table, a man freezes mid-bite. "Is this the pudding fork?" he whispers. No one knows. He panics and eats with a spoon. Etiquette books explode in popularity. Whole chapters are dedicated to fork behavior. Which hand to hold it in. When to switch. How to set it down politely if you need to cough. You meet a governess who teaches fork handling alongside penmanship and posture. Her youngest pupil, age 7, demonstrates his technique while reciting Latin. And yet, even as the upper classes spiral into utensil anxiety, the real story is happening on the factory floor, in the coal-dusted kitchens of working families. Because for the first time in history, everyone can own a fork. Not just nobles. Not just poets or scholars. But miners. Weavers. Dockworkers. You eat supper with a family in Liverpool, bacon, cabbage, potatoes. Nothing fancy. But everyone's got their own fork. No sharing. No fingers. Just simple, modern dining. The mother smiles and says, "Easier for the wee ones." Her daughter, maybe 6 years old, stabs a potato like a pro. Historians still argue whether the mass-produced fork led to better hygiene, but you don't need studies to see it. Public health campaigns begin promoting utensil use as a way to reduce disease. Posters in schoolrooms show children washing their hands and holding forks like heroes. You see one illustration where a fork is literally fighting off a germ, cartoon style. Meanwhile, the Victorians double down. Every meal becomes a performance. There's a fish fork, a salad fork, a dessert fork, a fork for asparagus, one for pastries, and another for ice cream. Yes, ice cream. You try it. It's not great. Design becomes a battlefield. Cutlers compete to make the most ornate, most absurdly specific forks. Some are shaped like swans. Some have bone handles carved into acorns. One has a detachable head for travel convenience. You wonder if anyone's life has truly improved from this. Quirky design alert. A popular trend emerges. Mechanical forks with hinges and spring-loaded tines, designed to fold or flip. One gentleman demonstrates his at a dinner party and launches a bit of veal across the room. Everyone claps politely. But even in this era of ridiculous refinement, the core idea remains: forks are now expected. They're no longer conversation starters. They're no longer smuggled in from Italy. They're just part of the landscape. In America, factories follow suit. You tour a plant in Connecticut producing flatware sets by the crate. For the frontier, for the new homes, for the modern table, the manager says. He tosses you a fork. Take it. We made 2,000 this morning. You keep it in your coat pocket. Just in case. On trains, in boarding schools, aboard steamships, in the dining cars of the elite and the modest kitchens of immigrants, the fork is everywhere. It's lost its mystique, but gained something else. Ubiquity. You realize with a strange pang that you'll never again be at a table where its presence is a surprise. No more whispers. No more hidden velvet cases. The fork is here, mass-made, mass-used, mass-accepted. And in the flickering factory light, you think, this tiny prawn thing, once so controversial, so delicate, so deeply suspect, has become the tool of the age. You're brushing lint from your best waistcoat as you step into a lavish Victorian dining room, and you immediately regret everything. The chandelier above you is shaped like a peacock. The napkins are folded into swans. And in front of your plate? 17 forks. You count them twice. One looks like it might be for combing lettuce. Another resembles an orthodontic device. Welcome to the era of fork overload. The Victorians, bless them, have taken the fork's steady rise and spun it into an elaborate performance. It's not enough to have a fork anymore. Now, you need to have one for every conceivable food item, in a predetermined order, arranged with military precision and enforced with judgment sharper than the cutlery itself. You attend a formal dinner hosted by Lady Fairhaven, who's widely feared for her fork stares, those icy glances reserved for anyone who picks up the oyster fork during the fish course. Her butler announces each course like a battlefield command, and everyone's hands twitch nervously. You're on your second fork before you realize your pinky is doing something weird. It's supposed to. Apparently. Historians still argue whether Victorian dining customs were rooted in genuine refinement or a desperate obsession with class signaling. Whatever the cause, the fork has become a social landmine. You pick up the wrong one, and suddenly you're new money, no education, possibly a criminal. You drop your dessert fork on the floor and half the room pretends not to notice. The other half faints. You try to play along. There's a fish fork, broader, slightly curved. A salad fork, shorter, tines flared. A pastry fork, with one thickened tine for cutting. You're not making this up. There's a serving fork, a carving fork, and something called a fruit fork, which turns out to be for stabbing bits of chilled melon while pretending you're not dying of boredom. Quirky tidbit: Victorian etiquette guides included full-page illustrations of fork positions, what each angle meant, how to signal to servants that you were done eating, fork and knife at 4 o'clock, and how to rest them if you were merely pausing, knife and fork in a reverse V, tines down. You actually see one man pause mid-bite just to double-check his pause position. His beef goes cold. His dignity stays intact. It doesn't stop there. Forks become symbolic, even poetic. One etiquette lecturer declares, the fork is the conductor's baton of the meal. It dictates the rhythm, the grace, the discipline. You're pretty sure he's never had to eat peas with one. You visit a silverware shop in London where the shelves gleam with sets boxed in velvet. The shopkeeper informs you that the 12-course collection includes 84 pieces per person. We also offer a slightly humbler 8-course assembly, she says, clearly judging your boots. Fork use is now so codified that some schools for girls include daily practice sessions. One headmistress proudly informs you that her students can switch forks mid-meal without clanking. It's a sign of self-mastery, she says. You nod, wondering how self-mastery tastes with lamb. You have dinner with a banker whose home boasts custom monogrammed forks, each with a curled R for his last name. He claims to have one fork for every member of parliament. You ask if that's practical. He says, it's patriotic. You stab your potato and move on. And yet, in all this pomp and formality, something interesting happens. Even the working class adopts forks, just fewer of them, and without the fanfare. You visit a miner's cottage in Yorkshire. The meal is simple: beef stew and carrots. Each person has one fork. One. And it's used with confidence. No show. No rules. Just eating. Historians still argue whether this cross-class adoption diluted fork etiquette or cemented it as a national habit. But the fork, in its many absurd and practical forms, is now universal. The rich may drown in cutlery confusion, but the basic act, stab, lift, eat, is shared by chimney sweeps and dukes alike. In America, the same trend blooms. The Gilded Age spawns dinner parties that rival European courts. You attend one in New York where the hostess has flown in a French etiquette expert just to explain which fork to use with aspic. You leave early. Yet, across the Atlantic, things are simpler. A farmer in Kansas shows you his Sunday fork, a slightly bent silver number he bought from a traveling salesman. Got it for 2 chickens and a prayer, he says. He uses it for everything from eggs to pie. And you realize, while Victorian elites overthink every problem, most people are just happy to have a clean tool that keeps stew off their knuckles. The fork's symbolism has fractured. To some, it's still a badge of refinement. To others, it's a convenience. To most, it's just there. An expected part of every meal. And so, in this era of lace curtains and rigid rules, of manuals and monograms and madness, the fork reaches its Baroque peak. It's as much about image as it is about function. But it's everywhere. From manor houses to mill towns. From drawing rooms to diners. And somehow, it survives it all: every absurd variation, every etiquette quiz, every terrified glance down a table flanked by more forks than a porcupine. You're in a diner now. Not a palace, not a banquet hall, but a gleaming American roadside eatery sometime in the early 20th century, where a waitress named Gloria calls you on, the pie is always warm, and every table has a jar of mustard, a paper napkin dispenser, and, yes, a fork. Not 17 forks. Not gold-plated ones. Just one, durable, no-nonsense utensil. And it's glorious. Because this is America's fork moment. The century has turned. The corsets are loosening, the classes are blending, and the Industrial Revolution has handed the fork to everyone, from oil barons to newsboys. You watch a boy eat meatloaf with the same fork his father used for pie. There's no etiquette lecture. No confusion. No guilt. Just pure utility. You finally exhale. Historians still argue whether America's full embrace of the fork was a byproduct of immigration, manufacturing, or sheer practicality. But you know the answer: it's all three. Factories churn out flatware by the boxful. Brands like Oneida and Rogers become household names. Forks arrive in Sears catalogs, mail order sets shipped by train to prairie towns, mining camps, and bustling cities. Housewives buy entire collections with names like Empire Silver or Modern Elegance. You hold one and it feels like both, sturdy and stylish, plain but proud. In Chicago, you meet a salesman who carries a sample set of 6 forks in a velvet-lined case. This one's for cake, this one's for fish, this one's for impressing your in-laws, he grins. But this one, this plain one here? It'll do everything short of raising your kids. You buy it on the spot. Quirky tidbit: in the 1920s, a restaurant in New Jersey offered Forkless Fridays as a gimmick, encouraging diners to eat with their hands like their ancestors. It lasted 3 weeks before too many customers complained about gravy stains. You dine with a steelworker in Pittsburgh who owns just 2 forks. One's clean, one's for backup, he shrugs. You visit a brownstone in Brooklyn where a Jewish grandmother insists her meat and dairy forks never touch, according to kosher tradition. Even forks have boundaries, she says. You nod solemnly. Then there's the rise of the specialized fork. Not aristocratic anymore, American. Ingenious. Functional. You see corn forks, barbecue forks, pickle forks, fondue forks, carving forks with insulated handles, salad forks with bent tines to help grip lettuce, cocktail forks that barely make contact with anything larger than a shrimp. You even find a grapefruit fork, serrated edges for citrus vengeance. They're sold not as luxuries, but as solutions. Forks for every problem. 1,000 little answers in stainless steel. You sit in a New York City hotel where a 5-course meal is served with just 2 forks, because no one has time anymore for Victorian drama. The waiter swaps them out as needed. Efficient. Clean. American. Then, one afternoon in a Kansas diner, a trucker slides into the booth across from you and digs into his chicken fried steak with a fork made entirely of Bakelite. "Picked it up in Tulsa," he says. "Doesn't rust. Doesn't judge." You laugh until your coffee goes cold. But it's not just America adopting the fork, it's America reinventing it, branding it, packaging it, turning it into a symbol of equality. Anyone can have a fork now. And more importantly, the same fork. Rich, poor, young, old, everyone uses the same basic implement to eat everything from fried green tomatoes to canned peaches. And with that universality comes something new, indifference. The fork is no longer foreign, no longer revolutionary. It's invisible. You ask a waitress if she prefers forks or spoons, and she shrugs. Never thought about it. Fork's just there. Historians still argue whether this American democratization of the fork marked its triumph or its total loss of mystery. You sit in a lunchroom in Milwaukee, watching steelworkers eat with the same four-tined fork used at a White House luncheon, and you decide, maybe it's both. Because the fork has stopped being controversial. It's stopped being sacred. It's just normal. And somehow, that's the biggest victory of all. At a department store in San Francisco, a child throws a tantrum because his fork has the wrong number of teeth. His mother sighs and replaces it. You remember when kings used golden forks in secret. Now a toddler demands 4 tines, evenly spaced, or there will be screaming. In Mississippi, a church potluck features dozens of mismatched forks, some bent, some shiny, some probably older than the building. No one notices. No one cares. They just eat. And then you attend a family reunion in rural Georgia. One aunt brings a cake, one uncle grills sausages, and one great-grandmother, 94 years old, takes out a small wooden box and lifts a silver fork from it. "My daddy gave me this," she says. "Said it came from Italy." She eats her peach cobbler with it like it's an heirloom sword. No one says a word. Everyone understands. You leave the party that night feeling like something's come full circle. The fork, once a symbol of vanity, rebellion, sin, intellect, wealth, order, and excess, is now a quiet companion on every American table. No ceremony. No explanation. Just a bite. Then another. You step into a school cafeteria somewhere in 1970s America, plastic trays clattering, sneakers squeaking, and steam curling up from metal bins of mystery meat. And right there on the edge of every tray sits something different. Not a fork. Not a spoon. But both. Combined. One head, 2 identities. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the age of the spork. Yes, the spork, half spoon, half fork, all confusion. You pick one up and feel its smooth plastic body, the shallow bowl with short, hesitant tines barely capable of puncturing a meatball. It tries. It fails. You try again. It mostly scoops. You sigh. This is either a utopian utensil miracle or a plastic crisis pretending to be progress. Historians still argue whether the spork was born of necessity, laziness, or bold, if misguided, innovation. Some say it emerged in prisons and schools where budget constraints demanded multi-use tools. Others point to military kits and camping gear, places where packing light mattered more than elegant dining. Either way, it catches on fast. You see them everywhere. Cheap. Disposable. Confusing. You eat lunch with a 5th grader who tells you, with solemn pride, that he once cut Jell-O with a spork. "It took 10 minutes, he says. "But I did it." You high-five him. He deserves it. At a fast food joint in California, your taco salad comes with a spork wrapped in a paper napkin. You ask the teen behind the counter if they have regular forks. She shrugs. That is the fork. She's not wrong. But still, quirky tidbit, the patent for the modern plastic spork was filed in 1970, but similar hybrid utensils date back to the late 1800s, early versions made of metal with oddly menacing tines. They were used mostly for desserts and, one would assume, gentle self-defense. The spork spreads quickly in places where single-use efficiency is valued over finesse. Hospitals. Airplanes. Correctional facilities. You visit a boarding school in Ohio where students are given sporks at every meal and forbidden to use outside utensils. One girl whispers she snuck in a real fork from home. "I keep it in my locker. For macaroni emergencies." But the spork isn't just a tool, it's a statement. It tells you that you're not here for artful dining. You're here to eat something vaguely edible and get back to algebra. or to your shift, or to surviving one more layover. And yet, some people adore the spork. In fact, some collect them. You meet a man at a flea market with over 300 unique sporks, wooden, metal, biodegradable, glow in the dark. He calls himself a practiforctionist. You pretend not to smile. In the design world, the spork sparks debate. Minimalists love it. Etiquette purists loathe it. You attend a dinner hosted by a performance artist in Brooklyn who insists everyone eat a 3-course meal using only a titanium spork. By the main course, someone's crying softly into the gnocchi. Meanwhile, back in your everyday wanderings, you see the fork holding firm. At restaurants, in homes, in wedding registries. But the spork hovers at the edges, always the plan B, the sidekick, the slightly less dignified cousin no one invites to formal events. You visit a camp in Montana where every scout is issued a metal spork on a carabiner. It's everything you need, one says, holding it up like a badge of honor. Except when it's not, another mutters, trying to eat baked beans that slide helplessly off the tines. Still, the spork does some things well. It's excellent for mashed potatoes. It shines with coleslaw. And for pudding? Perfection. You eat an entire chocolate cup with one and almost forgive its crimes against salad. Historians still argue whether the spork represents innovation or compromise. You decide it's a bit of both, a weird little emblem of the modern world, trying to do too much, not quite succeeding, but hanging on anyway. You take a plane to Tokyo and are served noodles with a fork. Not a spork. Not chopsticks. A fork. You blink. Globalization is real. Back home, you eat takeout pho with a plastic fork and weep gently into your broth. The fork has gone global now, standardized in shape and material. But the spork lingers as a curious artifact of a century that just wanted everything faster, cheaper, and in one piece. You sit in a cafeteria again, watching people scoop, stab, slurp. No one complains. No one questions. It's just what you're given. You wonder if someday archaeologists will dig up a landfill and find thousands of sporks, tangled in napkins and crumbling foam trays. What will they think? That we were efficient? Confused? Too busy to care? You glance at your tray. Mashed potatoes, handled. Peas, not so much. The spork is doing its best. So are you. And in that moment, you realize, even this strange little hybrid has earned its place in the great, sprawling family tree of the fork. The screen lights your face now, an endless scroll of product listings, shining stainless steel, bamboo, matte black, gold-plated, ergonomic, collapsible, toddler safe, dishwasher safe, emotionally overwhelming. You're on Amazon. You've searched for fork, and there are 45 options on the first page alone. Welcome to modern fork madness. You're no longer navigating a royal banquet or ducking scorn at a Renaissance salon. You're choosing between a 4.8-star reviewed titanium salad fork with micro-serrated grip tines and a 12-pack of decorative dessert forks shaped like cats. You didn't even know you wanted decorative cat forks. Now you're wondering how you've lived without them. Historians still argue whether this glut of fork options represents consumer freedom or late-stage capitalism melting down. You sit there, phone in hand, trying to remember when the fork stopped being a utensil and became an identity crisis. Your kitchen drawer doesn't help. You open it and see 6 mismatched dinner forks, 3 salad forks, only 2 with the same handle, 1 oversized barbecue fork you never use, and a cheap plastic spork from a long-forgotten delivery meal. You stare at them all, wondering how this became your life. You go to a wedding registry site and find entire pages dedicated to fork selection. Modern or classic? 3 tines or 4? Satin finish or high polish? Your friend chooses a set described as elevated yet grounded. You quietly back away. You visit a home goods store where a shelf wobbles under the weight of options: dinner forks, cocktail forks, oyster forks, pickle forks, carving forks, serving forks. And then, just when you think you've seen it all, you spot the absurd: a digital fork that buzzes when you eat too fast. You hold it like it might explode. It doesn't, but something inside you does. Quirky tidbit: in 2013, a real product called the HAPI fork was launched, an electronic fork that tracked your eating pace and uploaded data to an app. It was supposed to promote mindfulness. It mostly promoted anxiety. The company faded, but the legend remains. You eat lunch with a coworker who brings her own travel fork, a collapsible titanium model that fits into a sleek case the size of a lipstick tube. "It's better for the planet," she says. You nod, stabbing your quinoa salad with a compostable wooden utensil that's splintering in your hand. At a tech conference, you meet a man who 3D prints his own forks. "I can adjust the tine curve for each dish," he explains. "Even color code them for macros." You smile. You change the subject. Meanwhile, design blogs rave about fork minimalism. You read a piece that says, "All you need is one perfect fork for life." You look at your junk drawer and quietly close it again. At a trendy bistro in Portland, the server explains that each course comes with a thematically curated fork. You're handed one made from recycled bike spokes. It works fine until the beet salad stains it permanently purple. "Adds character," the chef says. You believe him. You don't forgive him. Historians still argue whether we've reached peak fork. They debate whether the multitude of forms is a triumph of personal expression or a symptom of choice fatigue. You think it's both. Because even with all this variation, most people still use the same basic design every day. You sit at a friend's table and realize their forks are the exact ones your grandmother had. Heavy, dull, slightly bent at the tips. You eat a bite of roast chicken, and it tastes exactly like it did when you were 10. And that's the thing, beneath all the options, the fork hasn't really changed. The essentials remain: a handle, a few prongs, a purpose. You pick up a fork today and it connects you, however faintly, to every hand that's held one before. From emperors to peasants. From philosophers to factory workers. From plague survivors to online reviewers who rate forks with the passion of poets. You find yourself back in your kitchen late one night. Hungry. Tired. You open the drawer, grab whatever fork is closest, and dig into cold leftovers straight from the container. No ceremony. No rating. No titanium tines or algorithmic assistance. Just a fork. Just food. Just you. And somehow, in that moment, it feels like everything that came before has led right here. You sit at a table, your table, and the light is soft now. Not candlelight. Not gaslight. Just the familiar glow of your kitchen bulb, humming quietly above you like a tired narrator. The journey's nearly done, and before you is something simple: a plate, a meal, a fork. And for the first time in a very long time, you pause. Not out of indecision. Not out of etiquette anxiety. But to really look at it. The fork, the thing that survived priests and plagues, crossed continents in velvet pouches, got mocked, blessed, banned, mass-produced, monogrammed, digitized, and dropped into school lunches wrapped in cellophane. The thing that was once seen as decadent, then foreign, then fuzzy, now just expected. You twirl it in your fingers, remembering how it began: two delicate prawns in the hands of a Byzantine bride, scandalizing an entire wedding feast. Remember the whispered judgment in Venice? The sermons in Florence? The scoffs in Paris and England and Boston? And yet, it endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was stubborn. Because it was useful. Because, when no one was looking, it quietly made sense. Historians still argue whether the fork's journey was inevitable or entirely absurd. You think it was both. You wander back through memory, passing that Florentine poet who had 9 forks for 9 courses. The English noble who used one only for pears. The American child who learned to eat Jell-O with a spork and never gave up. The mathematician who saw geometry in its tines. The bishop who thought it mocked God's fingers. The widow who kept one as a keepsake. Each had their reasons. Some poetic. Some practical. Some just hungry. Quirky tidbit to end on: there are now forks with built-in Bluetooth, designed to track your eating habits, encourage mindfulness, and even suggest recipes based on how fast you chew. They are seldom used twice. You think about how often we resist change, how we cling to old ways even when they no longer serve us. And yet, how sometimes, quietly, beautifully, we adapt. Not with revolutions. Not with declarations. But with small gestures repeated over dinner tables for generations. You take a bite, and in that bite, just you, your fork, and the food, you feel it all. The history, the absurdity, the ordinariness. This weird, pokey little invention that once sparked sermons and scandal, is now how we eat. And somehow, that makes it kind of magnificent. The fork rests quietly on your plate now. The meal is done. The dishes can wait. Let them sit a while in the sink, softening under the hush of warm water. There's no rush tonight. The hum of the world outside has dimmed. The wind has gentled. The traffic has softened to a whisper. In this moment, you are full, not just from food, but from a story that stretched across time and tablecloths, through kingdoms and kitchens. Take a breath. Let it out slowly. You've walked through 1,000 years of human hands reaching for something better, sometimes out of vanity, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes just for a cleaner bite. And every one of those hands, in some quiet way, led to yours. The fork has lost its mystery, yes, but maybe that's its magic. It slipped in, settled down, and stayed. Quiet, helpful, constant. Like most of the good things in life. So rest now. Let the lights dim a little more. Let the night settle in around you like a soft blanket. You're safe. You're home. And tomorrow, when you eat again, you'll hold a little piece of history, unthinking, unknowing, unless maybe, just maybe, you remember. Sleep well, my friend. The story's done. Sweet dreams.